Let me ask you something. Do you find it difficult to understand what you're reading in the Bible? You read a verse, maybe a set of verses or a chapter, and you just wonder, what did I just read? What do these words even mean? Why am I even reading this book? Sometimes it makes absolutely no sense to me. Hey, if that's you, stay tuned, because what I'm getting ready to share with you can be a game changer when it comes to understanding what you read in the Bible. Hey, my name is Tracy Barnes, and welcome to TEB Talk, where I talk about all things that people of faith wrestle with. And today I want to talk about something very, very important when it comes to you reading your Bible, but even more importantly, understanding what you read. And the key to this is a simple word, but a very important word. It is the word context. Context is important. It's important in your day-to-day life. You cannot make sense of what's going on in your life apart from context. That is, the conditions and situations that are happening around you. And as you understand those situations, those conditions, you begin to make sense of your life. Well, the same is true when you're reading your Bible. You need to know context, because if you don't understand the context, there's a good chance that you're not going to understand. And if you don't understand what you're reading, then there's an even greater chance that you will misapply what you're reading. Context is a game changer, and you need to understand it. Now, here's what I want to share with you. When you're reading your Bible, anywhere you're reading, any verse that you're reading, that verse or a set of verses has multiple context. There's always a cultural context. That is the way in which people lived, how they thought about the world in which they found themselves. Culturally, a cultural context. There's a historical context. That is, every passage that you read, you need to understand is situated in a specific time period against a backdrop of certain events. Then there's a literary context. That is, the Bible is made up of different forms, literary genres. These genres or forms have their own rules for reading, and if you don't know them, you'll end up trying to read all of these different forms in the same way and get confused. And then there's surrounding context. That is what comes before and what comes after whatever it is that you're reading. Cultural context, historical context, literary context, and surrounding context. All of these matter. They make up what we call context. So let's begin with cultural context and just get a quick overview of what this is. Well, let me put it this way. When we think of cultural context, it is the proper context for interpreting the Bible, and that context is the context that produced it. That is, the people who lived in that time frame. You will never begin to understand fully what you're reading if you don't know the culture in which these people came from. Because you need to understand this Bible was written to ancient people, people who lived thousands of years before you and me. In other words, the Bible was not written to you and to me. It was written to people who lived a long time ago. Yes, it is written for me, but it was not originally written to me. And if I'm going to understand the Bible, I'm going to have to get into the heads, into the mindset of the people that produced the Bible. I need to get into the mindset of that first century Jew. I need to get into the head of that ancient Hebrew. Otherwise, I will probably place my worldview into the Bible and then get very confused because my worldview differs greatly from their worldview. That's known as cultural context. Then we have historical context, which is very important. Historical context is just simply the history of the Bible. Most people, when they're reading the Bible, don't think of it as being a historical book, But the truth is, it is very much a historical book. In fact, when you begin reading in Genesis 12, where God takes a man by the name of Abraham and calls him out and enters into a covenant relationship with this man, as you read about Abraham and then his son Isaac and then his grandson Jacob and so forth, you're reading history of an ancient people, a Hebrew people. And this history moves from Genesis right on all the way through to 2 Kings chapter 26. It is a long, continuous history. If you don't see that and understand that, you could easily get lost into what you're reading. The truth is, for many of us, we've been conditioned to read the Bible not merely as a historical book, but rather as a book that has spiritual or moral lessons that I need to draw. Well, it does have a lot of moral lessons that I can draw from, but it's larger than that. It's a historical book, and I need to know that history and understand that history if I'm going to make sense of it. The Bible also has a literary context. When I say literary, I'm talking about the literary genres, or the different forms, the different ways that the Bible was written, the different pieces of writing. For instance, in the Old Testament, there are 5 different genres. You have narrative, you have law, you have poetry, you have prophecy, and you have wisdom. And each of these different genres have their own rules for reading and understanding them. You don't read narrative or a story the same way you would read poetry that you might find in the Psalms. You don't read law in the same way that you read prophecy. They're different genres, and you need to be aware of those different rules that apply to each of those different genres. When you're reading in the New Testament, you find 4 very specific genres. You have the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Then you have the book of Acts, which is actually theological history. Then you have the letters. And finally, the book of Revelation. Each of these 4 genres have their own specific rules for reading and understanding them, and you, as a Bible student, need to be aware. If you're not, again, there's a good chance that you're going to misread and as a result misapply what it is you're reading, and worse yet, not even understand and eventually give up and say, what's the use? Context is huge, huge, huge. Then finally, there is surrounding context. This may be one that many of you might be more familiar with, and that is what comes before and what comes after whatever it is that you're reading. We are too often tempted to take a verse and lift it out of its context. And when we do, we can easily misunderstand and as a result, misapply that particular verse. We need to learn how to read the Bible by understanding what comes before what I'm reading and what comes after what I'm reading helps me understand specifically what I'm reading. That is the surrounding context, the verses that surround it, the chapters that surround it, the books that surround it. Each of these give me some idea of what is going on and understanding what I'm reading. So remember, and this is very important, every text that you read has multiple context. There's a cultural context. There's a historical context. There is a literary context. And finally, there is a surrounding context. We've taken a big overview of this, but in videos that are coming up, I'm going to take a deeper dive into each of these 4 elements of context to explore them and to open them up to give you as a Bible reader and a Bible student a better understanding of how to read your Bible and thus understand it and apply it correctly. Hey, listen, if this has been helpful, one thing that you could do for me is to hit that like button and subscribe to this channel, because there's a lot of great content that's coming, and I want you to be in the know of what is happening. Hey, listen, thanks for being a part of TED Talk today. And as always, my desire for you is God's very best. Thanks for being a part of this.